Hi friends, Rick Edwards here with Sunday School University. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me for another session from the Gospel Project. Today, we're going to be looking at the core passage of 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 through 32, and then jumping over to chapter 14, verses 21 to 26. Two passages that are about two different kings. And the reason we're talking about two different kings, as you'll recall, just some quick context, we were looking at a united kingdom under Saul, and then David's son Solomon. But then Solomon, after his death, his son Rehoboam takes over, and through foolish leadership choices, the kingdom splits. So now you have the 10 northern tribes called Israel in the north, functioning and operating as a separate kingdom, and the one tribe of Judah and the Benjaminites, the tribe of Benjamin, in the south as one kingdom. And they're called Judah. So you have Judah in the south, Israel in the north. But Jerusalem and the Davidic dynasty, the Davidic kingship, is in Judah. Okay? So northern tribe of Israel, southern tribe of Judah. And today's text, this text is about how both of these kings managed to fail. And they both failed in similar ways. Now, I would encourage you, as you look at this, as you get your lesson started, as you bring your people together, I would encourage you to look at both passages together. Read them both so you have a sense of what's going on. Don't read one and then talk about it and then read the other. I would suggest you do both so people can see the similarities between these two passages and the similar mistakes that both kings made. Okay? So do that. And be sure to point out and make certain they understand that both kings failed in similar ways. That's significant, even though they're two separate kingdoms now. And one is really going off the rails, the northern kingdom. The fact is that both kingdoms are not doing very well. Both kings are making very similar mistakes. So here's a question that I would suggest that you ask at the beginning of the at the beginning of the session. And this really can set up a very good, healthy conversation, I think, about both texts. So the question simply is, what went wrong in the lives of these two kings, in the lives of these two nations, really, Israel and Judah, in the lives of these two nations, what in the world went wrong? Now keep in mind, this is the first set of kings following Solomon. So you had David's reign, which was a glorious, wonderful reign. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he messed up. Followed by his son Solomon, who is considered the wisest man in the world. And Solomon built the temple. God's presence filled the temple. It was a great season. And this time of David's rule and Solomon's rule is often referred to as the golden era of the Old Testament, Israel's life in the Old Testament. Right after that now is the period of time we're talking about. It was right after Solomon's great rule. Things are going terribly wrong. So my question that I would encourage you to ask, what went wrong? How did this happen? How did these two kings and the people, go so far off track? Okay. Well, I think you're going to get a lot of good responses from your people. You're going to get some very insightful responses. But I would encourage you to help them along to think about at least some of the things that might have gone wrong were these kings were self-serving. The decisions they made were decisions about what was best, what they perceived as best for themselves and their rule, their reign. They were very self-serving, and their self-serving nature, their self-serving behavior led to these actions, led to idolatry, and led to leading the people astray into apostasy. Certainly self-serving. But I think also you can point to the fact that both of these kings had a very immature faith. Their faith in Yahweh just wasn't very great. Now this is in contrast to especially their grandfather, or Rehoboam's grandfather, David. But even Solomon had a true personal faith, a personal awareness, a personal knowledge of God, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. But neither Jeroboam nor Rehoboam seem to have this same sense of knowing who God is, knowing who their God was. So I would say that they had a very immature faith that was subject then to the whims of other forces in their lives, political forces, perhaps economic forces. As things were taking place, they adapted their rule, they adapted their policies, they adapted the way they did things, now to include idolatry, because their faith was too immature to handle it, to resist that. Another thing was their fear. They were simply afraid that things were going to go wrong if they didn't make these kinds of adjustments. If they didn't do these kinds of things to bring the people into a place of greater contentment, or so they thought. So they were simply afraid, and that influenced their bad decisions. And then what I would call a loss of memory. The fact is, somewhere along the way, it hadn't been that long, but they managed to forget. They forgot who their God was and what their God had accomplished. It hadn't been that long since God had filled the temple there in Jerusalem. Many of these people probably saw it themselves. If not, their parents had certainly seen it, and they had probably heard about the stories not that long ago. And then King David, the things that happened to him, and the stories of Goliath, and all these things. Not to mention then going back even further to the Exodus from Egypt, the wilderness wandering, their time at Sinai when God gave them the law. There was so much history that should have informed their decision, that should have informed their worship of the one true God, Yahweh. But somehow along the way, they simply forgot these things, or they considered them no longer relevant. So it's what I would call a loss of memory. And by the way, we experience that same sort of thing. We hear the stories, but oftentimes we forget what God has done in the past, and suddenly what God has done in the past becomes irrelevant to how we are living today. The bottom line for how this could happen, what went wrong, the bottom line for these two kings is that they simply didn't know their God. They did not know Yahweh. You look back and you compare them to David and Solomon. Each of those kings had a personal knowledge, a personal relationship, a personal awareness of who God was. Jeroboam in the north, Rehoboam in the south didn't have that kind of personal knowledge. They didn't know the God of Israel. And that is, I think, ultimately what went wrong. How did this happen? How could this happen? How could they go so wrong so quickly? They didn't know the God of Israel. Now, I want to point out just one or two things. The purpose of the book of Kings, keep in mind that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings originally was one book. There was one book of Kings. But because of the length of the book, it was divided into two books. So in our Bibles today, we have 1st and 2nd Kings. But originally it was one book, so you can read straight from 1st Kings into 2nd Kings, and it's as though it's one book, just reading on. It's one cohesive story, one unified story. And the purpose of the book of Kings is to help us understand that the human monarchy that the people were operating under, the human monarchy that included David and Solomon, and now Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and the many kings that followed. When you get to the end of what we have as 2nd Kings, you reach this conclusion: this isn't working. And we've made another video, it's an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings, where we go into a little bit deeper detail about the purpose of 1st and 2nd Kings and the fact that the monarchy, the human monarchy that they're operating under now, simply isn't working. And we're seeing that quite evident now, even as early as Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the first two kings to follow Solomon. Things just aren't going well. The human monarchy simply isn't working. It is inadequate to accomplish God's purposes. And to that point then, I would say one of the great takeaways we need to have for this lesson, one of the great applications that we can make for this session, is that we too are inadequate in our own strength. We can look at these kings and say, oh my gosh, how could they do that? But the fact is, in our own lives, even we as Christians often fail. And we need to understand that, like those kings, we are inadequate in our own strength to live as God wants us to live and to accomplish his purposes in our lives. We simply can't do it in our own strength. And when you get to the end of 1st and 2nd Kings, the conclusion that we have to draw is that simply isn't working. We need a different kind of king. We need an eternal king. We need a Messiah. We need Jesus. That's what we know as New Testament Christians, understanding, looking back, saying, okay, the human monarchy didn't work. That's because we need a different kind of king. And we see once we get into the New Testament that that new kind of king was in fact going to be Jesus. And Jesus is how we can accomplish God's purposes in our lives, because we cannot, in our own strength, do what God wants us to do. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you next time.